You're all set.
Great, thank you. Okay, there's Susie. Perfect. Good morning, everyone. I just called the strategic committee meeting to order. I'd just like to remind everyone, just to be respectful for everyone's time, just keep a look, just keep an eye on the clock. I would like to aim for a 9 o'clock stop if possible. Of course, you can ask your questions, but every time you ask a question, just keep the clock in mind so that we're respectful of everyone here because we have administration joining us. We just have one discussion item on the agenda, and that was the feeder pattern at the middle schools. To quickly recap, at our last meeting, we talked about the feeder pattern into our two middle schools, Scotts Ridge and Eastwood Middle School, and we wanted to see if there were any educational impacts on the education or the way education is delivered at Scotts Ridge Middle School because of the 50-50 feeder pattern split. Going back a few years, we went to a 50-50 feeder pattern split. One of the main reasons was a budget driver. Karen, you can correct me if I ever say anything incorrect. One was a budget driver. It helped reduce a team at Eastridge Middle School, which obviously saved cost at that time. And also, there were concerns that the kids from one of the elementaries were being split, and therefore there were the two main reasons. But the main reason was the budget savings. Again, going back, we have all heard that Scotts Ridge was built for 40% of the middle school population. And there have been questions or concerns raised, and maybe it was during COVID, that because of the 50-50 split at Scotts Ridge Middle School, does it impact the educational experience at that school? As we go through this process, just to keep in mind that even though Scotts Ridge may have 50%, it's still, and Karen, this is historically correct, at a time, even when it was built for 40%, even when they had 40% of the middle school population, they did have much more enrollment numbers than they are projected to have at this current time, right? Okay.
That is correct, because our total enrollment was higher at that time.
Okay, so at our last meeting, we asked the administration to do two things: to come back with us with data that shows how the current enrollment looks at both the middle schools, at both Scotts Ridge and Eastridge, at a 50-50 split, and also to look at or give us numbers at what it would look if we went back to the old feeder pattern of the 60-40. And that's what we're going to discuss now. I think I summed it up. Did I meet anything else? I don't think I missed it. And the other thing we did ask them, because of the way enrollment is going, to look at the high end of the enrollment, high end projections. And as we go through this discussion, I would just like to remind the committee that their projections enrollment is not 100% science, and we are looking at the high end. So we could have lower number, much lower number. So just to keep that in mind as we go through this. I can't find, Susie, can you share the page? For some reason, it's not popping up for me.
We're ready to share it.
Okay, thank you.
John, if you don't mind, if you can share. Perfect. And Tina, just let us know when you want us to scroll.
Okay.
Do you want to describe the chart?
Yes. So as you can see, on the left-hand side, you have on the top is the feeder pattern modeling, right? And this is the schools, how the kids were divided with the three schools, 3 elementaries feed into Scotts Ridge and the 3 elementaries that feed into Eastridge. On the left-hand side of the high-end projections for 2023 going on all the way down, and this is at the 50-50 feeder pattern split. I think it goes to 27-28. That's with the 50-50. On the right-hand side, you will see the high-end projections. If you go back to the previous feeder pattern, that was the 60-40 split to both Scotts Ridge and Eastridge. And I'm going to let everybody just look at the numbers. We can just pick up 23, 24 for next year. So just to make sure everybody's getting what I'm saying. So for the high-end projections, if we stay at the current feeder pattern modeling, 6th grade at Eastridge would have 168 kids. And if we go back to the previous feeder pattern, we will have 192 kids at 6th grade at Eastridge. And so it goes on till 27, 28. We can just look at the high end, I think, for our conversations, because the medium obviously goes lower and the lower will go up the lowest, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think your most drastic change would be in the high projections.
Yes. And that's why I think that's the best time to discuss this. So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, again, Karen and Dr. De Silva, we are looking, when we look at class, is there a certain number that we need to look at a grade that may impact the educational experience? So if we're looking at these charts, do you see a number? Is there a number we should be looking for and that may impact class sizes?
Susie, would you like me to address that?
You can jump in and then I'll elaborate maybe.
Okay, sure. So at the middle school level, we value and have a team model. And that means there are 4 core teachers on that team: social studies, mathematics, English, and science. So if you conceptually think about our maximum class sizes are about 25 to 26 is what we strive for. So if each of those classes was 25 times 4, our number would be approximately 100 per team. We right now have 2 teams, so we would look at a target of 200 as kind of like a point where we start to look at. Above that is when you really would start to impact class sizes, particularly when you start leveling some of our classes.
Okay. So as everyone, I'm just going to highlight a couple of years, which if we take 200 as a base number, that may impact class sizes. I think if we had the high-end projections, we only see, or not only, I shouldn't say that, in 25, 26, we see Scotts Ridge possibly at 7th grade at 200 kids, or sorry, before that at 6th grade at 24, 25. And if we go similarly, we flip and we go to the previous feeder pattern, we will see that Eastridge deals with that number in 25, 26. And then, of course, it goes to 7th grade and then 8th grade. The way it just flows.
So based on what Karen just described, whether it's Scotts Ridge or Eastridge, the problem is still the same, right? So if you're looking at above that 200 mark or so, then you're looking to expand a team. Mm-hmm. Again, whether it's at Eastridge or Scotts Ridge. And so from a staffing perspective, that's about 4 educators if you're just looking at the core teachers. If you're looking at it from a financial lens, that could be upward of, or about somewhere between that $375,000 and $450,000 range.
So just make sure I'm looking at the chart correctly. With the current 50-50 feeder pattern, we could see Scotts Ridge hit that 200 number, but not exceed it on this high projection. But going back to the previous feeder pattern, we could see Eastridge go up to a 220. Is that right? Which would necessitate another team.
So you're looking at year
27,
27, 28.
Yes. So if we went to the previous feeder pattern, you would see that Eastridge would end up at 220 in 6th and in 8th at 205 kids. So perhaps in that particular year, you might end up with two expanded teams. In that particular year, I mean.
Right.
Yep. Anyone have, Ken, Selena, do you have questions on the projections, the 50-50 and the previous feeder pattern project numbers?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay,
I
Ken?
can't see, but here.
Ken? I guess he's good. Okay, so
Tina, and Jonathan, when I go back, because and Ken was on the board at the time, Selena wasn't, but when I go back and think about when the conversation began around why we were looking at a possible change, obviously it came from, I think, from, Malone McBroom shared their enrollment projections. And then obviously we saw that it was, the balance between Eastridge and Scotts Ridge was no longer there. Based on what Karen has described historically, that was a known, right? When they made the shift to, I think, when they made the shift and reduced the teams at Eastridge and made the shift to Scotts Ridge, there was a known that we weren't always going to be balanced. We can never get exactly 50-50, I would imagine. But the goal was to save money.
Yep.
If that's fair. I don't know if that's a fair statement, but I believe that was the intention. Is that right, Karen?
It was. And just to elaborate on what Tina said in the very beginning, when she said it was a budget driver to reduce a team, it actually reduced a team for 3 consecutive years. So first in 6th grade, then in 7th grade, then in 8th grade. So over that 3-year period, we were down 12 teachers.
Right.
And
So
going back to that feeder pattern, we could be back up 8 of those teachers in a few years.
Right.
Yes, so it's a budget. If we're looking at budget numbers, which we just went through a process, we have to keep that in mind. So any decisions we make does have budget impacts.
And
Sorry, go ahead, Karen.
no, I interrupted you. I'm sorry, Tina.
No, I was just going to say, and correct, and this is just a question. So, and this is me trying to understand. So let's say we go back to the previous feeder pattern and we look at Eastridge 27-28 and we see 220 kids. And so Eastridge can physically add a team. Yes, because they have the space, Scotts Ridge cannot. However, if we add a team, and does this just shift the problem in the manner that if we divide the 220 into 3, does it completely reduce the class sizes? So for example, the kids at Scotts Ridge, the classes will be 21, 22 kids in 6th grade for the core classes. And because Eastridge would have 3 teams, it would go down to 15, 16. So we're not really addressing we can't really, as you said, Dr. De Silva, we're not really addressing we can't address how our population is distributed because enrollment can go up and down. However, what we maybe need to keep in mind is at what number does it impact the educational experience? And if there are ways that we can, if there's a number or there are ways to maybe lessen that impact, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Karen, what were you going to say before? And then
Well, I was just sure. I was going to say at 205, it is likely the board and administration would not break into another team. And if that happened at Eastridge, we would just be moving the class sizes of 26 that are currently, the potential at Scotts Ridge over to Eastridge. So you're not solving a problem by moving kids to Eastridge. You could just be moving the problem.
The other part of, so you asked 2 questions, I think, Tina, within, so first, I think the issue of class size and equity. So if you did break a team, let's say that the district wanted to invest after that, 205 or whatever that key number is, and you broke a team, it is true, then you would have higher classes at Scotts Ridge than you would have at Eastridge because you're breaking. So you're taking those 25 kids and spreading them across, let's say 4 classes. So you're going to have classes of 16 versus another school that was have classes of 22, which, to be fair, that happens now in an elementary school or anywhere else. You might have a class at Veterans Park that is far smaller than a class at Barlow Mountain. So that is oftentimes what could happen. Or is expected to happen. And, fare isn't always equal and it's not always at the same time. It shifts throughout a child's educational experience. So that's true. The second question that you asked is, what would we do? We come across the challenge even now. So for example, when we're looking at math placement, and Corey could speak to that a little bit, but when we're looking at math placement, depending upon where students land based on our recommendations or even perhaps waivers, you might see classes that exceed 26 kids. And so then we have to start thinking about what do we want to be sure that our children have when the class sizes get 26, 27, 28. And so I think it's up to the Board of Education to think that through, but some of the recommendations I might make, for example, is an additional paraprofessional available or a tutor in some of those classes, or, possibly even a co-teacher or a team teacher, if that was appropriate, that, maybe could navigate across content areas. So I think those would be considerations once we recognize that the experience for children may be varied. It may actually even happen this year. You may hear me come to the Board of Ed this coming year with a recommendation, depending upon where class placement lands for mathematics, where you might hear me make a recommendation for an additional tutor or para in some of these classes that have high numbers of kids to additionally support the classroom teacher. And we would, of course, give them training in whatever we needed to give them training in. So there are ways to mitigate the issue with teacher to student ratio. As for the actual classrooms and the size, I think that's another consideration, is that what I do know, when we had to measure the spaces during the pandemic to see whether or not we could bring more students in, or we had to stay in cohorts, certainly the classes are smaller at Scotts Ridge, and that's because they have some built-ins and things like that. It's a newer building, but not significantly smaller. So I think if I remember correctly, East Ridge was about a foot bigger, not enough, let's say, to bring all the kids in. And so it's not that the classrooms themselves are bigger, it's just that there are more classrooms. Yep. It's also true, though, that the common areas are smaller at Scotts Ridge than they are at East Ridge. So we know that the auditorium is smaller. We know that the cafeteria is smaller. And that, I'm assuming, came from the design of thinking that the building would hold X number of kids. That said, it doesn't really, you're still, regardless of the way that you slice this, you're not going to be able to fit 3 grade levels in Scotts Ridge's auditorium regardless. So the fact that you might have 20 less or 20 more kids isn't necessarily going to change that. The cafeteria, certainly you could spread kids apart more if you had more space, but it's not that we can't fit 220 kids, let's say, in the Scotts Ridge cafeteria. So those things are also true, and that those have been conversation points that we've had at this committee.
Ken, Jonathan, Selena, any questions?
You get a feel from the building leaders at Scotts Ridge. How would Scotts Ridge feel at 580? Yeah. Would it feel like it's bursting at the seams, or feel basically the same as it does now?
At 500 and what, Jonathan?
I'm just looking at the highest year of Scotts Ridge would be 580, 582 total.
Right. So I think, Karen, when Scotts Ridge first opened, when Tim Salem got there, I think we were close to that number. Am I correct?
I believe so.
Yeah. I think it felt to him, if you heard Tim describing it, felt tight. There's no doubt that, again, your halls are wider, but then your common spaces are smaller. It's not that you, at 582 kids, that you don't have the capacity. You do, and you do in the classrooms as well. So that would be, I think, the 25, 26 year if we kept it as is, right? So I think that they would say that it feels like there's a lot more kids, but certainly as the way that the kids are broken up, at least if that projection came to fruition, I think is manageable at the school level. Again, it doesn't, and that's another piece that we have to remember. Not all classes are created equal. We find that, all the time, is that depending upon the diversity of needs of students, strengths, challenges, you could have a class, a 6th grade class of 150 kids and a 6th grade class of 220, and that 150 feels like a lot more than the 220, just based on the needs of the kids and what we need to provide to them. So I think that the principals feel comfortable enough to come to the administration, the cabinet level, and ask for support when they need it. And we have those conversations all the time, and ebb and flow throughout within our budget right? Because that's what we have to do when it's happening in that moment. So to answer your question, Jonathan, 582, I'm sure Tim Salem would say it feels like a lot of kids. I think the way that they're broken up, I think he would say that their educational experience could be met. With that, I think he'd also say if the kids had challenges, regardless of that number, that it's harder to meet their needs, and he'd be asking for additional support in some capacity.
Dr. De Silva?
Yes, Karen,
I just went back to the first year that we did the class size report, which is 2010, 2011. And at the enrollment at Scotts Ridge at that time was 582.
Oh, wow.
Oh. Good question, Jonathan.
So doesn't look like there's a benefit to going back
Yeah.
to the previous feeder pattern.
That's
It-
right.
But, no, go ahead.
I thought that was Ken. I think there's a little bit of a crystal ball with all of this, and that it's not, I wish that we could predict exactly what this would feel like or be like, but that's hard to do. And given the small shifts and the impact, again, it's not just, by the way, it's not just staffing, because when you think about a change like this and the impact that it does have. Now, I'm not suggesting that families and kids aren't resilient and they can handle it. Absolutely. And we would put things in place to make sure that they could. And we've thought that through also, right? But there's always a transition plan, and whether or not that's for busing, right?
I was
With
gonna ask,
dual
yeah.
busing, right? If we grandfathered kids in, what those costs would be also, in addition to staffing. Because otherwise you're really, without those pieces as considerations, then you're really not solving for anything, in my opinion. And I haven't taken the time to measure the hallways at East Ridge versus Scotts Ridge, but I don't know that Scotts Ridge halls are that much more narrow than East Ridge. As a collective consideration, and something that we've been thinking a lot about, not just because of this conversation, but at the elementary level, is just staffing in general, right? So when you have, a school of, let's just take the elementary as a primary example, you have a school of, let's say, 225 kids, and then you have a school of 375 kids, staffing needs are different, right? Even though they're both elementary schools, and that's why you heard us come to the board this year and ask for additional supervisors at certain schools and not all schools. It's not to say that the other schools don't need them or wouldn't benefit from them, but there are greater needs when you start increasing enrollment. And so I think that is something that we have to be watching and be mindful of, because that might mean when you have 40 extra kids, you might need a little bit more intervention support from the interventionist or special education, which we use that model all the time, right? We shift staff from point A to point B, given the needs of kids. So I think that's an important piece that we have to keep in mind. So it's not just closing the door on this conversation, but watching carefully and identifying how we can support the school as a whole, which again, doesn't necessarily mean, make that transition. And if we are going to make that transition and the board says, well, we don't want classes at Scotts Ridge of, 205 kids, we'll have them in East Ridge, then I think the board has to be in a position to be willing to take on the cost that's associated with breaking another section, because otherwise you haven't solved for anything.
Yep. And as you mentioned, we do add busing costs and grandfathering. So there are other expenditures just beyond the number you mentioned. And I'm just going to add in there, we just went through a budget process. And it was incredibly tough. And, at the end of the day, only 6.9% people came out to vote. So every time we have these conversations, I think as a committee member and as a board member, I like to keep that in mind too. We have to if we're going to make a decision, we need to understand it's not perfect. And if there's a fiscal or financial cost to it, you're right, Dr. So we have to be ready to commit to that cost.
Yeah, and just one other point, and I know we didn't scroll down to the medium projections, but I want to say that my first, thanks, John.
Yes.
Someone's paying attention, John Mansfield. When I began here, the first fall, so that November, we weren't looking at the high projections, we were looking at the medium. So when you look at the medium projections and the current feeder pattern, you're not seeing the same. I mean, don't get me wrong, the numbers are still higher at Scottsridge than they are at Eastridge. But when you're looking at that bubble of 200 across the grade levels, it's close, but not quite there in the same way that it is with the high projections.
Agreed.
So let's just say that happened to be where we ended up, right? Not in high. Again, we don't have a crystal ball. Again, if you're looking for 50-50 perfect or 40-60 perfect, I'm not sure how you're going to get there.
No, not. So I don't know if the committee agrees, but I don't think there is a huge advantage moving to the previous feeder pattern, keeping all these projections in mind. And, we'll keep with the caveat, of course, these are just projections and not hard data. And the fact that, just Karen, historically, Scottsridge has been able to handle a much higher number than was projected, a 582 as the highest projection at a 50-50 split.
Yes, what I think just makes this current situation more pronounced is when they were at 582, Eastridge was at 742.
Wow.
So now we're seeing 580 something at Scottsridge and then in the 400s for Eastridge. So I think that's also just culturally part of it. I'm not saying that they didn't have that number and could handle it. That's just we're down over 300 middle school students since that time.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Tina,
Yes, Selena, sorry,
Can
go
I-
ahead.
I don't know how to raise my hand when I'm on.
That's okay,
a
go
phone.
ahead.
But Karen made a really good point earlier, and I think it was Karen that said this, that we really need to be careful to not move one problem to another. So whoever said that, I've been listening and really closely, and you all are making some really valid points to keep the numbers like they are. We don't want to just scoot one problem over to the.
Yes, I said that too, because eventually we'll have to deal with it either at Eastridge or Scottsridge, and maybe the way it is, and I think Selena, you said it at the last meeting too. We leave it to our principals, right? They're the ones who understand their school the best. We are there to support the administration, listen, but they're the ones who go through. They know their school much better than we do. They understand what class sizes and numbers mean and how their classes are divided. So maybe what we as a committee, maybe we bring this to the full board, is that we did look at the numbers and we believe at this point that we leave it to our principals to come. And if there is a time, and if let's say we do end up with the high end projections and the class sizes are getting too high at Scottsridge, and maybe they come to our board and we add whatever support, or we are willing to add whatever support they need, be it an extra teacher. I don't even know, there's something like a core and a team and a half, or whatever supports we can add so that the educational experience is not taken away from such huge class sizes. And that means we're not shifting the problem to Eastridge. We're just trying to address as is, keeping the current numbers in mind. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I
Does
mean,
make sense.
I'm in total agreement, and I can't see what you all are looking at, but I'm been listening intently, and what you're saying totally makes sense to me.
Yeah, I keep going back to, we do all this work. There's no way to guarantee an equal split, even with 60-40. There will always be years when numbers will be slightly higher at either or the school. The only difference is Eastridge can add a team, but again, that's a financial cost. I keep going back to the budget season we just went through. It was so tough to get through so much. And, every time we add more costs, it possibly may take away from other things that are needed. So we have data that has shown that Scottsridge has been able to handle. It's not ideal. I think I will go back to it because I am from Scottsridge and I know, and maybe I'm wrong. The reason this came up again was because as Dr. De Silva said, was the numbers that were shared. Also, COVID brought it home a little bit more, because you had to space out the kids more. So I guess people started paying more attention to the numbers. But we have done it at Scottsridge. And I think as a board member and somebody who went through Scottsridge, I have full faith in our principals that if there are concerns and if our classes are too big at any time, they can come to the board. And I think the board will be willing to support whatever needs there may be. I mean, that's the best solution at this point in time. And I agree with you, Dr. Still. We can't close the door if need be. I mean, certainly we have an explosion of kids coming in, and that's a whole entirely different conversation. But as of now, given the data that we have, in my opinion, moving to a 60-40 split seems so much work, including the cost, the grandfathering in, people move to a certain district thinking they're going to middle school, so many other things to factor in. We just keep the 50-50 feeder pattern, with the caveat that if there is a need, we trust our principals and our school administration to come to the board.
And we revisit the question if we get to a year where we exceed these high projections.
Absolutely. Yep. So the conversation, we're not closing the door. We're just acknowledging that as of now, this probably seems to be the best solution. We're supporting the needs of our kids by letting the people who know them best come to us. We will support if ever there's a need. If they're listening in, we are here to support. We do not want to impact the educational experience at all, and the board is supportive of that. But maybe as a committee, we can agree that we come to the board and say, looking at all the data, we would like to keep to the 50-50 feeder pattern.
I think one of the things that maybe just clarify, it's not really a 50-50 feeder pattern.
That's
it's
true.
Just the feeder pattern, right? It's
That's true. I know we're so used to saying that. Yes.
Yeah.
Because it's not 50-50 enrollment, it's 50-50 of our 6 elementary schools.
Yes, that's
right.
Yep.
That makes sense.
We call it 3-3 feeder pattern, 3 elementary, 3 to Scott Street.
Yes.
Maybe that's the best way. I know it started 50-50 and I've always wondered that, but I know what you mean. Sorry, Dr. De Silva, you saying?
No, that makes sense. I think, the point that Karen brought with the end back in however many 10 years ago, when it was 700 plus children at Eastridge and 582 at Scottsridge, I think that really does resonate most, because that is what we have. I mean, think about it. If the population went up to 2,000, right, you'd have to somehow navigate that 2,000, right, in some capacity, and you're still going to have to try to max out as much as possible at Scottsridge, and then figure out what to do at Eastridge with teams.
And I think at this point, it seems that's the best way to leave it. We see how this plays out. For now, it doesn't seem, even with the high-end projections, it seems doable. And Scottsridge has gone through it. And if there is ever a need, our school principals can come to the board, administration can come to the board, and we can talk about adding any support or how to mitigate or add any mitigating strategies to ensure the educational experience of these kids is not impacted.
Makes sense.
There. Selena, you agree, right? Selena,
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Jonathan?
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay. Okay,
So
so
Tina, you're going to bring that back to the
Yes.
full board as a
is that
recommendation?
okay? All right, so if the committee agrees, that's what I'll bring and present to at the next meeting. That's where we landed at. I'll write a summary of what we discussed, the numbers that were shared, and then we can take it from there. Does that make sense?
I think
Makes sense
that's
to me.
good.
Okay, perfect. Oh, this was easier.
Just while I don't know that, just so you know who the little square is there, I'm sure this committee at some point is going to talk about transportation.
Yes.
So the little square in the corner there is Billy Gramajo. He is our new transportation director. He took the position after Rick Lupinacci retired. So he's there in a little square. I asked him just to join in if he could listen in if he had a chance this morning. So that's why he's there. I just didn't want you to think it was a stranger in a little square. He's one of us.
All
Hi,
right.
Billy.
Thank you.
All right. Sorry, Billy, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say hi to everyone.
Hi, Billy.
Pleasure being on the strategic meeting.
Welcome. Oh, I'm sure we will be seeing a lot of you as we talk about transportation moving forward.
Sounds good.
Okay. Well, okay, this was easier. So just going to conclude with this. I'm going to repeat just again. We're going to bring it to the full board. We decided this is the best way to stick to the 3-to-3 feeder pattern. I'm going to start rephrasing and not call it 50-50, hoping it catches on. And for the principals or if any administration, either school is listening in, the board is obviously going to always be, we're willing to listen. If you ever have concerns, we are willing to partner all the time with the administration to ensure that all the kids get as similar an education experience as possible at both the schools. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. If there are no more questions or concerns, we can end early. Yay. It was much easier than I expected.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of
Thank
the
you.
day.
Bye-bye.